thank you again, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. I'm really excited to be talking to you all. Just a quick introduction. Obviously, the UK network, you'll know me. I'm Sarah Turner, the Managing Director of TTI Success Insights in the UK. And I'm really pleased to introduce Porrig Berry, who's the CEO of TTI Success Insights Ireland. So hi, Porrig. Thanks for co-hosting with me this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Very happy to be here.
And Porrig's going to interrupt me probably quite frequently and add his own comments and his own thoughts in here. So one of the reasons that we wanted to create this masterclass around the driving forces sciences and using DISC and driving forces together is that when you're using the tools as part of your debrief, you might have had conversations during that debrief, during that coaching session, where the word why pops up. It happens every time I personally do a debrief or anytime I have done a debrief. As we know, when we're working with DISC and behaviours, all we're really talking about is the how somebody does something, the style in which they do it. And during that debrief, as I say, you'll probably start bordering into, but why does somebody do that? Or what's the reasoning for that? Especially if this person, if we're talking about somebody we have conflict with, that you might be thinking, I really struggle to sort of get into their mind or understand why they do the things that they do or why they behave in the way that they do. And I always tell everybody that actually the minute you start talking about the why, the minute you go into why does somebody do something, you're no longer talking about behaviours or DISC. Okay, so the minute that comes in, why do they do this? I just can't understand why they do that. You're not talking about DISC anymore. And as we know, DISC and behaviours is an amazing tool, but it is surface level. And anytime you want to go any deeper into the surface and start looking at that why, you need to start looking at a different science. And that's what driving forces, or for those of you who have been around a little bit longer, you may have heard it being referred to as motivators. So driving forces, they're a viewpoint, they're a way of judging or a mindset, the way we value something, or the reason that we get up in the morning. What's our personal why? What drives us when we wake up in the morning, what gets us out of bed and makes us want to go into work or want to do something or want to volunteer for a particular charity. So it's that, why do we get up in the morning? And that way that we value things. So they actually develop through stages of our life and can be related to periods of conflict, pain and fear, or joy and deep reflection. And that can be a negative experience and it can be a positive experience as well. So these driving forces and values, they develop through all the stages of our life and they are constantly being refined as well. So whilst they are set in stone, if you like, formed by the time that we're 16, 17, 18, around that kind of age, they are constantly being refined and can change if you go through that significant emotional event that we talk about on the DISC and behaviours accreditation. And they determine what things we enjoy too. So what we can engage with, what we disengage with as well, and what we reject completely. So have you ever wondered why, one person really loves doing something, another person doesn't at all, or why somebody, volunteers hours of their time for a particular cause, and you might think, what do they get out of it? What's in it for them? These are the kind of things that our driving forces determine and shape. They're unwavering, and they're also the way that we see the world. And we have an expression that we like to say, which is that we each see the world through the lenses of our driving forces. So it is like those driving forces are a pair of glasses that we put over our eyes, and that's the way that we see the world through them. And that's why when it comes to conflict, actually driving forces is the biggest determiner of the biggest determining factor of conflict, not behaviours. Yeah, behaviours is surface level and the style in which we do things. And yes, it can be a little bit irritating sometimes if we have different behaviours. And of course, we can use the science of DISC and behaviours to help us with that and help us understand people better and communicate with each other. But actually, when it comes to more deep-rooted conflict, the way that we're seeing the world, the things that we value and the things that we reject completely, That's what we mean when we're talking about driving forces. So these are the things that we focus on when it comes to driving forces, how we see the world, those glasses that you put over your eyes, and that's why it's more deep-rooted than behaviours in DISC. So for those of you who are familiar with EQ, emotional intelligence as well, you might be thinking, how does this fit in with EQ? So anything within this circle, or what we call it the onion, anything that's got a star next to it, that means that TTI Success Insights has a measurement for that particular science. Anything that has a triangle next to it, it means that we know it contributes to superior performance in the workplace, but we don't necessarily have a measurement for that area. So I want to share with you the way that we describe the relationship between DISC, driving forces, and EQ. And it's probably something that you haven't seen before, but I think it really helps people understand that relationship really well. So you'll see there the three circles. We've got DISC, driving forces, and then we've also got EQ, emotional quotient, or for those that don't know, emotional intelligence. And DISC is all about how we do things, the style, what we see, okay, in a person. So, you know, how they respond to challenge, how they respond to people, how they respond to steadiness and pace, and how they respond to rules and procedures. So everyone is aware of that. So we see it all the time. When it comes to driving forces, because it's deeper and because it's underneath the surface and we don't see it as often, sometimes we have to have specific conversations, or there needs to be specific things that help us to see that, which we can of course bring out in a debrief. And then we've got emotional and quotient, which is all about your ability to regulate, control, and recognize your emotional responses to situations and people. So when you put all of those together, we like to think of it as TRI, so trigger, response, and impact. So driving forces will determine what you're triggered by. Now, I actually don't like the word trigger in the way that the kids use it nowadays, you know, where someone's triggered by something they see online, or, you know, out there in the public domain. But it really does, you know, explain this really well, in that as you go about your daily business, or as you talk to different people, if you're talking to somebody whose driving forces are very different to yours, and you're having a conversation about a particular topic, then the likelihood is that you'll be triggered by that particular conversation. So equally, if you're in a situation where your personal driving forces and the situation that you're in, or things that you're being asked to do, or even an organization, you know, that doesn't have the same driving forces as you will find that quite triggering. Okay, so that's what we mean by trigger. And then the second part of that TRI is response. So the way that we'll see that, and the way that that will play out, will depends upon your DISC and your behaviors, which we're all familiar with. So let's say, for example, you know, you're talking about something that really that doesn't speak to your driving forces at all, and you find that quite triggering. And the response that we'll see, let's say you've got 100 on the D scale, okay, and the response that you'll see from that will be potentially quite challenging response. Yeah, or if you were on the 100 on the C scale, you might decide to bring to that conversation lots of data and facts, and, you know, and analysis. So what we see, the response from that, what we see in somebody, depends upon their DISC style. Okay. And then finally, the impact, so the third part of that TRI, the impact, is your EQ. So if you have a really well-defined EQ, your emotional intelligence is high, then the impact that it will have, that situation will have upon you or other people around you, will be minimal. If you have a lower EQ, okay, so a less well-developed emotional intelligence level, then the impact that will have, that situation where you're triggered, will have upon you and the people around you is less so. Okay, so sorry, is more so. So the lower your EQ, the more impact it will have on the people around you and also yourself. So emotional intelligence is all about our ability to control that. And of course, the minute you take anybody through these three sciences, you're actually helping their emotional intelligence, you're aiding their EQ, because making people aware of this, and even us having this conversation now, will be raising your EQ, raising your emotional intelligence levels. So being aware of what situations do we find triggering, or indeed what people do we find triggering, is going to help, and is definitely going to aid people, obviously, in the workplace and in their personal lives as well. So that's how the three of them fit together. So think of it as trigger, response, impact, try. And that's the product in the middle there, where those three circles meet, is trimetrics EQ. And so some of you who actually use that product will know that that's DISC, driving forces, and EQ combined. And there's a great interactive, integrated section at the back of that coaching report, which actually does combine all three sciences and gives you a really good three-dimensional view of what to expect from this person, with all three sciences in mind on that front. So trigger, response, impact, DISC, driving forces, and EQ.
I mean, the only comment I would make on what you said so far, Sarah, is it's always interesting to see people who are only familiar with DISC, as you rightly pointed out in the beginning, and they interpret DISC in terms of values and behaviours. So, for example, a direct D, somebody scoring very high, they start talking about them being commanding, and they start talking about them being resourceful and bottom line focus. And of course, we're not measuring those things at all. We're only measuring how they interact with the world, not why they interact with the world. So I think that's a really important point. I really like your try, your trigger response impact. I've never actually presented that way myself before. And I think it's really neat. It's a really good way to understand it. I think you made another point that I think is important around driving forces. You mentioned that those who have known driving forces for some time know them also as motivators. But you will know, Sarah, that even before that, they were called PIAV, personal interests, attitudes, and values. And I actually prefer that name actually over all the names, because to me, it's the most descriptive. That when you think about driving forces, that you think about what's the person's personal interest, what interests them, what's their attitude to things, and what do they actually value. And I particularly focus on the word value. What do they value? And as a consequence, what engages them and what disengages them? And what will excite them? A good example would be somebody who's very resourceful. And a business opportunity comes along and they're on holidays. They'll take the call because it's important to them. They really value this. It's not they don't want to play with their children at the pool. They do, but this is business, they'll say. And so you'll hear them saying things like that. This is business. Of course, I'm going to take the call. This is money. So understanding that, I think, is really, really important. And I like the EQ element. Obviously, we all know that EQ is the foundation of most of these things. We have our how, our why, our what, our behaviors, our motivators, and our competencies. But of course, underpinning them all is emotional intelligence. And without it, the rest, it's not that it doesn't matter, but the rest is a struggle. With it, irrespective, the rest is easy. And the last comment I would make is that people often ask me on that point, which would you prefer? Or which is more important? The person who has the absolutely correct behavior and driving force profile for a role, for example, and poor EQ, or somebody who has very high EQ and a poor match for the role. And I'd always take the high EQ, because they'll be able to manage their behaviors, they'll be able to manage their own values, what's important to them, they'll interact with other people more effectively. So nice model, Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Actually, yeah, I always, it's interesting, as we go through, I'll talk a bit more about it. But if anyone asked me for a debrief, which science I could not do without, my answer would be driving forces, because when it comes to coaching and debriefing, of course, because I feel if I ever do a debrief just using one science, I almost feel like I've only got one arm, because you're constantly missing the context behind it. You can talk about DISC and behaviors and it's an amazing conversation. People go away from that conversation thinking, wow, I will never look at people in the same way again. And you will all have had that feedback too. But without the context of, okay, why, what's driving that behavior, I feel like there's a huge part of the conversation that's missing. So for me, driving forces is the one thing I can't do without when I'm doing a debrief. So, and yeah.
Sarah, it's interesting, as recently as the day before yesterday, I had a call with a client, and they were referred to me. They're not actually a client, they were referred to me, and they asked me if I'd support them in the recruitment of a very important role in the organization. And I said, of course I would. I asked them what were they thinking. They said, oh yes, we want to use DISC. And I said, that's great. And I said, why? And they said, well, because we're all familiar with it and we understand it, and we want to know about this person, how suited are they to the role? And I asked them the question exactly what you've just said. I asked them, but much more important, I said, on the behavioural side is how they will engage or disengage from this role, whether or not the role values and rewards what they're actually looking for as a person, i.e. their driving forces. And they couldn't really understand that. And eventually I convinced them to do behaviours, driving force and competencies, actually. And I said, do it, just try it, have an experiment. They had 5 candidates. I said, have an experiment. And I said, and trust me, when you've seen it, you'll never go back to looking at a single science again.
Yeah, so true. Wonderful. So just to give you an overview then of what we talk about, or what we measure when we look at somebody's driving forces. So what we've done with this graphic is you'll probably see some words here that might not make much sense. These words relate to the old motivators. So if anybody's joining us here that's familiar with those old motivators, this is now that will make sense to you. But essentially these scales, and this scale, by the way, came before, you know, how we changed the DISC behaviours graph from vertical to having a continuum, so that you've got that option available to you now. Well, one of the, I suppose, inspirations for that change was the success that we saw with the continuum on the driving forces side of things, on the motivator side of things, because that too traditionally was a vertical graph, and then moved to this continuum, and people just loved it. And I think the main reason that people love a continuum, horizontal continuum, is because it takes any connotation away from it being good or bad. You know, if you see a bar chart and you see a low score, your mind immediately goes to, oh, that must mean I need some development. And as we all know, for DISC and behaviours, that's absolutely not the case. You're not striving to have any particular behaviour. And similarly with driving forces, there's no good and there's no bad. It is just who you are. And so having that horizontal bar just really takes away any confusion around it being competencies, rather than just you are who you are. And that's great. Yeah.
One other comment on that. When DISC and driving force were both vertical graphs, of course, you only really got one side of the picture, pun intended. And for example, if you had a low score in D, I, S, or C, you didn't realize that low score, in fact, might be your predominant behavior. Or when you had a low score on a utilitarian or others or whatever, you didn't realize that, in fact, that low score was perhaps your most important driver, i.e., for example, you see there, you have on that particular graph, you have intentional. And intentional typically would have been a low a social score. You said, oh, I'm not really interested in people. But that's not true at all, of course. For this person there at 99, they are very interested in people, but they're interested in people specifically for specific purposes to achieve specific outcomes, and they work with them in specific ways. So it's a very intentional interest in people, in others, but it is a big driver, very, very important driver for people. And understanding that, I think, is hugely important.
Yeah, and so how this will look on a driving forces graph, to Porig's point, is that this will say knowledge. And what that tells us is this is looking at the way that a person values knowledge. That's how I like to think of this. So if you're on the left-hand side, which previously was like a low, but let's forget that now, but previously it was low, then people would think, oh, you don't value knowledge, as Poig just said, or on the intentional side, oh, you don't value people. It's not true at all. It's telling us how they value that particular area. So for this top scale here, that was formerly theoretical, that's now about knowledge. how do you value knowledge? Do you value knowledge as in your what we call intellectuals? So you like to read lots, study lots, gather as much research as you possibly can, or do you rely on your own knowledge, your own previously learned things in different situations? And that's what we call instinctive. So some people like to rely upon their previous knowledge, their intuition, if you like, that they've learned along their life. That it doesn't mean that they don't value knowledge. It just means that they value it in a very different way. So that's what we look at. Now imagine if you are somebody who is what we call intellectual, and you like to gather lots of facts, research something to the nth degree, and you're working with lots of people who are more instinctive, and they rely on things that they've learned in their life in the past. You can imagine how that would cause quite some friction, especially if you were preparing a project together. Okay, and the person on this side of the scale is saying, okay, well, where are the facts for that? We can't just go in and make a statement like that. We've got to have some facts to back this up. And the person here is saying, oh, we don't need to do that. We'll just wing it. It's fine. So you can imagine how stressful that would be on both sides of the scale. And equally, this instinctive person might be thinking, oh gosh, this is a snooze fest. We're having to take all this time to gather all of this research when we know what the answer is anyway. So these are some kind of conversations that you can imagine would be happening within a team when preparing for a project.
I want you to imagine that you have somebody working on your team and you're looking to reward them, and you're thinking you're going to give them a pay increase. And they're scoring, for example, they're over on selfless, they're not resourceful, but they're scoring very high on intellectual, on knowledge. The reward they're actually looking for is perhaps an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to do a course. You're thinking of paying them money, but that's not what they're looking for. What they're looking for is an opportunity to grow and to develop and learn new things, or maybe do more research, or have a day a week when all they do is work on particular projects, research projects. So understanding what engages people from this perspective, and what rewards them, and what the job needs to reward them, how the job needs to, what it needs to give them for them to feel satisfied in the role, is very, very important.
And then you go 0 to 100 to the left and 0 to 100 on the right. So actually, one thing that people assume, which isn't always true, is that if you are let's say you've got an instinctive driving force, that doesn't mean that you don't have any of the intellectual driving force, which is something that sometimes trips people up, because that's obviously very different to DISC and behaviours, of course, with their continuum. So we'll touch on that a bit later as well. So those are the driving forces. And this is all about combining DISC and driving forces in a debrief. So whenever you're looking at or thinking about the science of DISC and behavior and the science of driving forces, I want you to always have those two words in your mind at all times, because that stops you from getting tripped up. Behaviors is all about the how. How do you do things? How do you communicate with each other? How do you write an email? Okay. Driving forces is about the why. What's driving you to write that email? So, let's say if you're you want to complain about something, you've seen something on a TV program and you really don't like it, you want to complain about it. Why you're doing that is because of your driving forces. Okay, it's something that's to use that graphic from before, has triggered you and made you want to write that particular email. How you write the email depends upon your behaviors. So if you've got 100% on the D, you can imagine what that email might look like, versus having 100% on the S, etc. So keep in mind, just to help you out all the time, those two words: why you do something is your driving forces, how you do something is your behavioral style. Okay, so as we know, when it comes to debriefs, it's all about questions, always all about questions. Whenever we do a coaching debrief, or we talk somebody through their particular profile, the idea is to come up with some questions and to open up the conversation and to allow that person to tell you what they're seeing within the report.
Just one interesting comment here on the driving force cluster. Most of the people on my side of the Irish Sea here would be familiar with this and talking about the cluster. But it's important to understand, just like when we look at DISC, we understand in DISC that it's not just your D and your I standing on their own, and their S and the C standing on their own. It's the combination of the four, D, I, S, and C, that's really, really important. The exact same is true for the driving forces. So talking about one driving force on its own, while interesting and informative and useful, is not as useful as talking about driving forces in clusters. So when you were talking about your DISC, for example, and your behaviors, you're talking about your D and I, and how the I is impacting the D, and how the S is impacting the D, and how the C is impacting the D, and so on and so forth. The exact same is true in your driving forces. You have to look at the driving force as a combination. And the kind of example that I'm going to give you, if you look at what's there in front of you: resourceful, intentional, receptive, commanding. So resourceful is utilitarian. So it's the right-hand side of utilitarian. Intentional is the left-hand side of source of others. And receptive is all about new ideas, so as opposed to structured and methodologies. And commanding is all about control of your destiny and freedom, as opposed to collaborative. But it's a combination that's interesting, and how they reinforce each other. So that particular profile would be a very, very strong, I would say, commercial kind of profile. As someone who's bottom line focused, they work with people to achieve a result and an outcome. They're open to new ideas and methodologies, and they want to be in control. So if I was writing a statement about that, it's a really useful thing to do, to try and write what we call a primary driver for cluster statement. I would say something like, I achieve I achieve freedom and control over my destiny by working with people on new ideas to achieve a return on my time, energy, and money. So commanding, so I achieve freedom and control over my destiny by working with people intentional in ways that work, on new ideas to achieve a return on my time, energy, and money, resourceful. So think about these things, always think about these in combinations first on their own, DISC and driving force, and then think about the combination of the two of them together. So for example, if you look at the DI there, the D is a direct D, and we have that combined with resourceful and commanding. So the question then is, how do resourceful and commanding and intentional work with that D? The D, as we know, leans into problems and challenges. This is how they deal with them. They move forward very quickly on these things, but they're also here commanding. They want to be in control of their destiny. They want freedom. Their bottom line focus. So this makes for a very, very hard edge to D there, if you wish. That brings a harder edge to it. So I'm just going to hand back to you, Sarah. The only comment I just wanted to make there was, think about the things in clusters, think about the behaviors in clusters, how they interact together first, and try and get a sense of that. Then think about the driving force in clusters and how they interact together, get a sense of that. And then how they either, and Trevor actually from New Zealand is always talking about how things either strengthen something or weaken something. So are these driving forces strengthening or weakening aspects of the behavioral profile, and vice versa?
When we're thinking about these questions, obviously we all know the kind of questions we'd ask if this was just a strictly DISC and behaviours debrief. But when it comes to the driving forces element, some of the questions that we might want to ask would be, what are you driven by? What is your goal in life? What do you value in particular? When it comes to utility, we can see that this was this person's score. Now, as well, what's really interesting is an additional data point is you'll see here we've got the national means. So that's something that's perhaps a bit unique to people that haven't seen driving forces before and have only seen DISC and behaviours. Obviously, we have the national means for the DISC and the behaviours, but you can actually see them here on this bar. And what that tells us is that that's the national mean there, the 42, and this is a standard deviation. So a certain percentage of the population falls within this shaded area underneath the bar. So in the case of this person whose number one driving force is resourceful, so they're driven by practical results, they want that return on investment, they do not want to do something unless they're getting something back from it. Now see how far outside, not only is it their first one, but look how far outside of that standard deviation and the national mean that person is. So the average person would be somewhere here, and that person could not score any higher. I mean, if the questionnaire was 100 questions long, maybe that would end somewhere, but we don't know when it's 100, whether it's 100 or sort of 10,000. But what we can also see is that they're so far outside of that the average person, that it's going to be really obvious, especially in situations when you're working with this person, or maybe you live with this person, and this is the kind of scenario where someone reads that and really laughs and says, oh gosh, yeah, my colleagues, or my partner, whoever it might be, would really laugh if they saw this. So that means it's a super priority for them, and they're obviously going to value that. The first thing I would be doing if I was debriefing with this person is asking them, tell me about situations where you get frustrated. So, when you're, maybe it's work, or they might be self-employed, or home, whatever the context of the debrief is, what frustrates you? And they'll probably say something like, when it comes to work, it really frustrates me when we have meetings for the sake of meetings, or when we have meetings about a meeting, or when we have, a meeting that could be an email. I hear that all the time. I hate it when we have meetings that could have just been an email, because for them, it's all about that maximizing their time, and working smart, not hard kind of philosophy is something that you'll hear from them.
Yeah. May I comment there? Yeah. Well, the point that Sarah made there about the population means and the standard deviations applies not just here on where people are in the primary cluster. So, for example, if you look there at the coral colouring, you have one standard deviation either side the mean. So 68% of the population is lying in there. And then out on this side, of course, we have the second standard deviation with 12%, the third standard deviation with 2%. So this person is very, very extreme. But the exact opposite could be the case. This person could be scoring selfless 0, or they could be selfless 10 or 20. And they could be way outside the population mean as well. So if you look at their indifferent driving force cluster, that's the primary one, then you situational indifferent, you might find that they're indifferent to certain areas. And that's worth noting as well, because people can experience that. And that can be a frustration for them as well, because they're actually indifferent to it. They don't like it. They're not interested. They might even be a negative towards that particular area. So keep in mind these standard deviations. The last comment I'd make on that is, while that person is scoring 100, the next one is 97. These are very high scores. You might have somebody scoring over here. There might be somewhere, for example, around 50 or 60. That might be their highest score. And so you say their primary cluster is resourceful, intentional, receptive, and commanding. That's fine. But they're not an extreme score. So even though this is their cluster and this is what will drive them, it won't drive them the same way, or they won't seem as odd. I mean, this person would seem very, very extreme to a normal person. They would seem to be thinking only about bottom line on absolutely everything. So the closer they are in there, the less extreme to the mean, the less extreme that will actually appear to other people in the population.
Yeah. And so again, use these driving forces as almost like context with your behaviors. So I always actually personally like to start with the driving forces. If I was to do a debrief, start with the driving forces first, because that gives you the why. And then you can then talk about, and how do we go about this, or how do we see this in real life? So think of the driving forces as giving that context. So behaviors is all about, this is how you do things, and then driving forces, why you do them, relates to your driving forces. And so you can work down the different driving forces in the same way as you do with your behaviors. And as Padraig mentioned, you've got your cluster of primary driving forces, which gives you that focus, that vision, or that way forward in life. Then you've got your situational driving forces, which, as the name indicates, these are driving forces that you could rely upon in different situations, or would play out in different situations. And then finally, you've got your indifferent ones, which are lower scores. So that's how the report itself actually looks and is made up, with those different sections. But again, it gives you the context behind the how. This person. So, for example, if you were to talk about this person, you might say, let's call them James. James is, really assertive when it comes to challenges and tasks. He likes to just get stuck straight into things. And then the reason for that is because he is resourceful. He wants to maximize his time. He doesn't want to waste any particular resources. James likes to make short, snappy emails. So when you receive an email from him, it'll be short, it'll be snappy, it'll be straight to the point. The reason behind that is because he doesn't want to waste any time with Hi, Sarah, how are you? Hope you had a good weekend. So it's not that, oh, I've had an email from James and it's really short and snappy. And if I'm a high I, I'm thinking, whoa, what did I do to upset James? He hasn't asked me how my baby is or anything. But actually, no, it's not because he's not interested in me or what I did at the weekend. It's the reason behind it is all about the driving forces. They're driven by maximizing their time. So writing out, how was your weekend? What did you get up to? Is not a useful way of him spending his time. So that use it in that way. This is how the communication you'll see. The reason behind that is all about the driving forces. And that once you explain that to somebody, the amount of times I've seen penny drops where people say, oh, so it's not that he doesn't really like me or he's just not really interested in me as a person. It's because he's thinking about that return on investment. Absolutely. Yeah. So you can use it's that context that you need behind everything. In my opinion. So yeah, use the two together. It gives you this more three-dimensional view, especially if you layer in emotional intelligence as well, how they do something and then why. It just gives you so much more context, so much more dimensions when you're using this as part of your debriefs. So the biggest part, or the thing that I think helps organizations the most, and Padraig might have a different opinion on this, but for me, the bit where this adds the most value is when it comes to conversations, either one-to-one as part of a debrief, or if you're consulting, conversations with the organization around the difference between a person's personal motivators and the organization's culture or rewards, or the way that the job rewards people. So it can be about the organization, but it can also be about the job. So I want you to think about what it would feel like if you were somebody who had a really altruistic driving force. So you wake up in the morning to help other people. That's the goal for the day, is to help as many people as you can, help people who are in need. And you work for a charity. Sorry, you work for a sales organization where you're calling people and trying to flog, insurance to old people. Okay. And that they don't need it. That the product is really quite bad. And they're saying, no, come on, you need to get them to part with their cash. And that's not what you're about. You're somebody who wakes up in the morning to help people, not get money for something that they don't need or don't want and actually is really, really poor. So imagine how that would feel when you wake up in the morning to go to that job, to that organization, and your leaders within that organization all do not have that altruistic driving force as well. You would get that whole that feeling that I haven't had since I left school, which 5 p.m. on a Friday, on a Sunday, 5 p.m. on a Sunday, and you're sitting there and you're thinking, it's 5 p.m. Maybe, you can hear the Antics Roadshow theme on, and that means school's coming soon. Everyone's had that feeling. That's how you would feel if you worked in that particular organization, and those were your driving forces, and you would have huge disengagement. So for me, having those conversations with people around what's the culture of your people, what kind of driving forces do they have as a population, and then how does the organization actually reward those people? As Padraig said earlier, if everybody really values knowledge and has an intellectual driving force, how many people do you reward by sending them on a training course, or do you just throw money at it? It's so much more than just bonusing people financially. So having that conversation about how the organization rewards people, how the business rewards people, but also what's the actual culture of the organization? How do they champion people? So not just rewarding people like that, but what's the feeling of the kind of people that are respected and valued within the organization, and how does that fit in with the people that you've got currently there working within the organization? And so then for a person individually to have that conversation with them, how are you rewarded? How are you bonused? What's the culture of the organization? How do you feel that people are championed and valued? It just blows people's minds. and it's so valuable to do that. So for me, unlocking those kind of conversations that you probably wouldn't be able to have if you were just using DISC and behaviours, is super valuable. I don't know if you've got any comments on that, Porg.
Yeah, one or two actually. I really like to say I agree with you. I mean, so I wouldn't challenge anything you're saying, Sarah. I'd maybe just add to it. I once worked for a company in London and an accounting firm doing feasibility studies for new project development. And I always remember the day the penny dropped for me. I was sitting in the office, it was 3:00, and I was really wanted to get out of there. And 2 hours later, I looked up at the clock and it was 3:10. And I realized I was in the wrong job. And I think that there's always an ideal match. So in a role or in an organization, there are really strong matches in terms of, particularly in terms of driving forces, even more so than behaviors. However, I would also argue, and I believe this to be the case, that if somebody has a language, if they can name their game, if you give them a model so they can understand what motivates, what engages them, and other people can understand that, then you can find ways to use those driving forces to engage them in their work. So you can create roles and opportunities for them within that organization. So take that charity, that person was altruistic. Well, imagine that actually the opposite was true. Imagine that person was intentional and resourceful and they're working for a charity. And you say, well, hold on a second, we need structure and organization. We need somebody to manage this. We need to make sure the money is used properly. We need all these kind of good things, and can use these driving forces. You can manage the person, and so they can actually feel they're adding value and are adding value to the organization, albeit that they're not what we would normally say the ideal profile for that role. I think it's really important. I believe, like you, Sarah, I like to start with driving forces in a debrief. I think it's where you start with the why and you move to the how. And I think that also in terms of the talent continuum, this cradle to grave talent continuum from recruitment right through selection, onboarding, development, succession planning, and so on and so forth, that if you don't have driving forces, you're really at nothing. Talking about somebody's behavioral style is interesting. Without driving forces, how in heaven's name can you build succession planning? How can you say this is the skill set that we require for this role? Here's the best person for it. How can you even recruit people? How can you interview them? When you don't know what the job rewards or what the individual is looking for in terms of rewards, or what the culture rewards of what an individual is looking for. So I think I think these two sciences, this combination is deadly. I think combined with competencies for recruitment, it's really strong, and with EQ for coaching, it's a really, really strong model. There is a case to be made that if you only use a single science, you're doing a disservice to the client. I mean that sincerely. I know you say we would say that, but I honestly believe that is the case. And if you had to pick a science, I agree with Sarah. If you could only have one, it would be driving forces rather than behaviors. Even though it's not as sexy, I think it is a much more meaningful science to have a conversation with people about. And from a debriefing perspective, any of you who've been through Sarah or my training or on that will know that the debriefing process is very robust. It's a very, very robust process, a simpler process than the behavior debrief, but a much more robust process that elicits a much better response. I just saw the comment there from Donal on that. And those questions are very, very powerful, Donal, in driving forces, as you know, and really help people have a real understanding of why, and again, take Sarah's opening comment of why they are the way they are, why they're engaged or disengaged, why they enjoy their job, why they have conflicts with their partner, why. It is the big question. And I think it is definitely the first science to start with.
Yeah, definitely. And I think as well, Donal, one question I like to ask people that really draws that out, because sometimes, you can have a conversation with somebody and immediately you can identify what their behaviors are. But with motivators and driving forces, because it's a little bit more under the surface, it's not as straightforward, or it's not as easy to identify. If you ask somebody, where do you spend the most of your spare time? So what kind of things do you like to do in your spare time? For me, that really opens up a conversation that gives me some inklings. But of course, just like with DISC and behaviours, unless they've done an assessment, you'll never know for sure what their driving forces are or what their discount behaviors are. But you can start to get a bit of an inkling by just asking that question, or, you know, tell me some of your goals for life, tell me some things that make you feel frustrated, tell me about some things that you've seen online that made you feel a bit like you must comment, you know, like that feeling where you think, I know I shouldn't say anything, but I've got to say something. That's another example where you might be able to draw them out. Or, you know, what things do you feel influenced by, frustrated by? What things really engage you? What kind of projects did you really love working on within your organization? Some of those things that are a bit more deep rooted, but will perhaps just draw them out a little bit. But yeah, as we said before, unless they've done an assessment, you don't really know for sure. We're at 1:30 now, so thank you so much everybody for joining us, and yeah, the repeats will be on Porig's channels, and then for anyone in the UK network, you'll find the replay on the Diamond portal. We'll upload that in a couple of, well, probably today, but if not, tomorrow. So it's really nice to see everyone. Thanks so much. And if you've got feedback, suggestions as well for things you might like us to talk about, we're all ears, and we'll definitely take that on. So do you want to say anything, Porig?
Thanks a lot. Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks very much, everybody. It was great seeing you all. And thanks, Sarah. Great webinar. Well done.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. See you again.